Hello and welcome to Game Design Hour. I'm your host, Miles Goldsmith, and on each episode, I interview the people who create the video games you know and love. On today's episode, I'm interviewing one of the game developers behind the video game Among Us VR. Among Us VR is a virtual reality adaptation of the original Among Us game. Without any further ado, let's get into the interview. So, what was the first thing that really sparked your interest in creating video games?
I think usually I go back to I had in high school a computer science course. It was very bare bones. I don't even remember what we learned outside of like Hello World, but I made a very bad Hangman game. It did not work. Um, but I found that act of creating a little thing really, I don't know, just fun, especially since I don't really have that creative art skills, but I like to make things. So from then on, I'm like, oh, computer science can be fun. And then I had a friend who made really bad mobile games. I'm like, oh, right, making games is a thing you can do. So then when I went to college the next year, I did a combined degree of computer science and game development and was like, we'll just do like the first introductory class. We'll see how it goes. And then I just fell in love.
After college, how did you first really get into the games industry?
So I went to college in Boston, and Boston had a pretty decent sized and interactive game dev community. So my professors were very much like, reach out to people outside of our classes and stuff, and like was very like just all our professors were very much knew how hard it was to get into game development and like wanted us to succeed. So it was just a lot of different people going, go talk to this person, go to this meeting, join this club and like do this thing. So everyone was just like very helpful there.
So, when looking into and thinking about what the next game you all would create would be, what made you all want to go and make Among Us VR?
So I am pretty sure from like the conversations I was hearing about it, we wanted to go into Among Us VR because Shell was very much like, oh, what if we get back into like that MMO-esque genre? I don't think Among Us is technically an MMO, but like those multiplayer games that are online. And Among Us was just like kind of served at the perfect time. The studio in a while hadn't done any online or like multiplayer stuff. So it was really great to get something where it's like, this is an IP everyone knows. We don't really have to, do the will people buy this because it's Among Us. It's everywhere. People are going to buy it. So it was a very great, like, ease into it, I guess.
So, Among Us VR is an adaptation of a game that originally was 2D, third person, and not even really close to VR, and you all turned it into an amazing VR game. How did it work to take this 2D game and turn it into VR?
Yeah, it was difficult. Before I was officially on the Among Us team, I was on a smaller team called Roadrunner, which was just like rapid prototyping, stuff to do in between bigger projects. And one of the things we did was use existing tools that we had to make like those 3D Among Us things. It wasn't like super interesting. It was just like directly translating them into 3D. So that gave us a lot of insight into be like, hey, if we want to like do the gas mini game where you have to like hold the button and then take it somewhere, it's like, okay, well, holding buttons doesn't always feel great in VR, so how can we change that? And well, do we have to actually carry the gas can around and things like that? What do other people see when we're doing this? Because now it's in first person, so you might want to actually see something instead of just a little bean standing there. So there was like a lot more thought going into it than at least I had originally thought when I was brought on the team. Because I'm like, oh, it's just little mini games, but VR has so many edge cases.
Pretty much every game has strange or interesting ideas that were thought about for the game at one point, but just ended up getting cut. What were some interesting or strange ideas that were talked about for Among Us VR at one point, but just never made it into the final version?
Well, I know they're planning a lot of things, so I don't want to say it'll never appear. But I know a lot of brainstorming we did was like things where it's like when people are like watching, if like I'm doing a mini game but like someone else is watching me, like did we want to have the best way I can describe it is like when in cartoon like kids cartoons when they fight and it's just a big pile and then they'll have like kabam bam, bam, like things like that, but like more mini games like beep boop ba, that kind of thing to be like, oh, they're interacting with something, but then we're like, probably not because we don't want people to actually know if you're doing a mini game. But then it's like, but maybe we do want that. Like you can pretend to do one or something. And there was a lot of fun mini game ideas that I think did get in. Like I know we were talking about whack-a-mole because we're like, oh, that's like a fun long time mini game and things like that. But I don't think that one explicitly got in, but other ones similar. I also remember thinking of new sabotage ideas, things that we can just do like only in VR. I don't remember exactly what they are, but I'm hoping that they make it into the final game at some point because they were very fun and would change the way the game is played.
That's really cool. So, when starting work on Among Us VR, was there anything that you looked at with the original game and you were like, I want to improve on this or I want to change this?
I know the mini games were a really good place for that, and that's why if you play the VR ones, like you can see the classic ones, but there's also a few that are different. You know, you probably wouldn't see in the 2D because we're like, okay, you know, we can only have so many of these, and we want people to be familiar with Among Us, but not like, you know, we don't want to do a direct one-to-one. Another thing that I know we had a lot of ideas for, but I don't think we're able to get in was like changing how the voting worked. I was going through our old documents and there was like a lot of interesting ideas where it's like maybe we should isolate the player. And, you know, it's like one of those like reality show hidden buttons where like you can hear everyone, but you can't see what they're doing. I know one thing we wanted like a huge screen where you can see what everyone's doing. So it's like a live feed from their thing. But then we're like, I don't think the network would enjoy 30 live screens. We also had a really cool idea that was like a ballot box. So instead of just like, you know, pointing and clicking on who you want to vote for, you had to physically pick up a little like picture and put it in the box. Those all had issues that I won't super get into that we couldn't, for reasons why we couldn't do them. But like, we had some really fun ideas.
So, when working on any video game, managing scope is really important. How do you all work to manage the scope of the game while working on Among Us VR?
I think tech drove a lot of those conversations because, like I said, Shell hadn't done a lot of like networking stuff. So we were not making it up as we go, but like listening to tech a lot because they were like telling us what we could and could not do. So a lot of our scope depended on like getting that networking up working and really fast, because as soon as we knew how much data we could pass through the network was like, okay, this is how much we knew we were going to do. I know when we first started, we had like a million hat ideas and, you know, we're like, we'll have a bunch of mini games and things like that. But like, as it, as we figured out more and more how to actually make the game, we're like, okay, so we'll have some hats and then we'll do more later, and like learning all of that because networking was a challenge.
While the VR game still feels very similar to the original, it also feels different in some ways. While you kept many elements of the original there, you also changed some things. What were some of the things that you changed or adjusted from the original when going into VR?
Yeah, I think the things we kept saying while making it was that like this is the Skeld, which is like the map, but we're going to call it the Skeld 2, right? Because we wanted to make sure that it was reminiscent, you know, so longtime players are comfortable and familiar, and new players are like, oh, okay, I think I've seen this somewhere. But yeah, a lot of the things that we wanted to like keep new were like, you know, we're like, oh, we know in the medbay it has the scanning thing. So how do we make scanning fun in VR? Because, you know, in the 2D game, you can't see the door. Like that's the interesting part. But when you're in first person VR, you can just turn. So we're like, oh, what if we have an eye scanning mini game? So you have to look towards the wall and you can't see behind you. Another thing was like, how do we keep the social deception thing? Because like all the mini games that you do Among Us are in service of that deception. So when we were figuring out like how should the player traverse and like how should the mini games appear to the player themselves and like versus the outside player, things like that, where it's like, okay, we know we have to make sure that the player can't see outside when they're engaging in a thing, because if you're in the 2D one, like you don't want to be able to see where everyone's coming from. So a lot of the things we did were like, how do we keep this social deduction game, keep the like not fear of Among Us because it's not really that scary of a game, but it is like a, oh no, is that guy gonna be the imposter and get me because I'm alone right now? So it was a lot of trying to keep that feeling while understanding we're now in like a first person perspective and how to adapt that while keeping that same feeling.
While working on the game, what was the process for playtesting the game and different elements within it, and what important information did you learn through playtesting?
Yeah, so I think one of the very first playtests we did was when we were still figuring out the movement. I don't think they were moderated, so we kind of just sent these out and then got the information back. And what we did was we were debating between the movement we have now, which is like, just first person move your stick, and then a second one that was kind of like your camera stays and you like use the stick to throw out your avatar so you can watch your little guy run in circles or whatever. And when you let go of the stick, you'll teleport there immediately to try to get rid of that, VR sickness that some people feel. So we made like a fun little maze. It wasn't too difficult, but something that forces the player to like move around and stuff. And it was a lot of trial and error where it's like, okay, did you like this weird 3D movement system? No. Okay, why? How do we fix that? Did you like the first person? No, you're sick. Okay, well, let's figure out 8 more ways to vignette. A lot of our early stuff was how do we give enough options for vignetting because we don't want anyone to get sick because this is you have to move to play the game. And we're like, oh, teleporting doesn't really work as well because if you like have that little thing and you're like, I want to go 5 feet that way, and you teleport there immediately, well, now you're moving faster than the players who aren't teleporting. If we have you delay, so let's say you move 5 feet and it takes 3 seconds to move those 5 feet, so it's just black for 3 seconds. Well, now you don't know what's going on in the 3 seconds that you're walking that way. So playtesting that movement a lot was really to hone in and make sure that one, people aren't getting sick, and two, that we're still trying to keep everything fair, because it would really suck if someone gets an advantage just because they can't move in VR, which is a thing a lot of people can't do. So
how did you all eventually land on the movement system you have now and the options and changes people can make to make it easier for them to move with motion sickness?
Yeah, so we chose the movement option we had now. Actually, I think it's a better version than what we had because we had more like tank controls, which was a little awkward. But we landed on that because it was the easiest to add a bunch of vignette options, which are like, either the grid when you move or the circle that gets bigger and smaller to occlude your vision. We decided to not do that like third person movement scheme. One, because we found out that it was an easy way to cheat, because if you put your camera like at the edge of a wall, you can then make your character run into a corner and just run in circles so you can constantly see who's coming by, but they can't see you. And also we couldn't occlude vision the way we wanted to because we were trying to add like some sort of fog or something around the player. So when they were moving their little guy, they wouldn't be able to see as much. So they'd be able to see about the same as someone who's using a vignette. But Scope couldn't do it, maybe in the future. All the vignette settings we had we were trying to throw in as many as we could to give people as many options as they could. So we played games like we played VR chat, saw what they had. We watched someone play, one of our coworkers play, I forget what it was called, but it was like a kart racer game, which same people can play that, but that had a bunch of like, goggles, vignette, the grid. It had like a million different options. So we like looked to see what that was, because if people can basically play Mario Kart in VR, they're doing something good. So it was a lot of just like, I think originally we just had the grid, and then I know I and a few others were like, the grid makes me more nauseous than not having anything. So we're like, okay, we need the grid and the vignette. And then it's like, okay, if we have vignette, how big or small, how strong should we make it, and all that jazz.
What do you mean by vignette?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So vignette is if you've ever played a VR game and you move and like a dark circle appears around your vision. And then usually when you move, it'll get like smaller and tighter to make you have more of like a pinhole view. So you can change like the strength, so how small that gets, or like I think it's called feathering, which is like how light it is around the edges. It basically just like forces you to wear goggles, or if you've ever worn like a really big hood that has fur and you can't see everything. So that way it takes out your periphery, because I think that's where a lot of the motion sickness comes from.
Many of the mini games in the game are copies of stuff from the original game, but they're brought to life in a new way in VR. How did you all go about bringing these mini games to life with the VR and the interactiveness you get in VR?
Yeah, so a lot of things we were thinking about was like, okay, a lot of these mini games are you hit a button and you wait, you hold a button and you wait, you hit a button, you walk over there and you hit another button. So we're like, so what are things people like to do in VR besides hitting buttons? Because hitting that emergency meeting button is very fun, but you don't want to always just be slamming buttons. So we're like, oh, like the pumping action or like pulling a lever is very fun because it's like forcing you to move your arms. Like basically we were trying to avoid like dinosaur arms because we also wanted to have an option where if you're holding like a controller, you can just like point and use the trigger for people who don't have like full mobility. But we didn't want everyone to just be like sitting with their, you can't see my hands, but like that with the controller. So we're like, okay, well, if we're gonna, eject the garbage, make sure this is like a really big, feels heavy, put the haptics in if people are okay using haptics. If we're having something that like needs to be pumped, like make sure we're actually doing that pumping motion. So it's like it was a lot of what actions are actually fun to do in VR but aren't too, strenuous or whatever, because we don't want to alienate anyone who maybe doesn't have that like mobility that we can like edit and change to make it more fun. When we're doing the keypad, making sure that keypad is big enough where it's your big dumb hands in VR don't accidentally hit the other buttons and stuff, but still making that feel very good.
Were there any mini games from the original game that you looked at and didn't think you would be able to bring it over, or that you had a difficult time bringing over to VR?
I don't think there were any that we were like, we can never do this, but there were a few where it's like, how are we going to adapt this? Like, I think I mentioned it earlier, the gas mini game where you have to fill up a gas can and then take that gas can somewhere else and then empty it. We were like, should we give the players like a utility belt so that way when they look down they can see like the gas can hanging there and things like that? Because it's like that's one of the cool things in VR. Like you want to feel feel like you're in the video game. So it was more things like that. Like can we afford to have like that extra geo in the level? Can like how are we going to actually fill the gas can? Because as we've said, holding a button doesn't feel very great. I don't think there were any where it's like we can't do that. It was more like should we do that? Like is this the point of this mini game is to make the player wait at point A for 10 seconds, then go to point B and wait for 10 seconds, forcing them to move. So it's like, were there other things we could do better that force the player to like move, if that makes sense?
Which parts of Among Us VR did you have to put the most time and effort into to get just the way you wanted it?
Ooh. There's a lot. Because I think like this was, a game that was free to play that a lot of people play. So we were very much trying to be the best VR version out there because like, you can go into VR chat and play that for free. So like what makes us, the one that you want to I think it's like $10 to spend to play. So I know like the getting that art style down was very important. I think one of the first thing the artist did was make a beautiful corner in the oxygen room and like seeing that come to life was like, oh wow, we're doing it. But like gameplay wise, again, it was like all in the service of like this deduction game. So it was excuse me, trying to figure out how can we still make this game like, you know, it's still like a oh no when someone comes around the corner, but it's still like fun to play when you have to like go type in that key card and make sure that you're swiping the the card at the right speed and things like that. So it was a lot of like I don't want to say balance, that sounds like the wrong word, but like finagling to make sure that like, those small things still feel correct because people know what this game is and if it doesn't feel like Among Us they're gonna be mad.
So you all took one of the original maps from the game and brought it into VR, took the 2D map, made it 3D. Were there any difficulties with doing that, and how do you go about doing that? And also, why did you decide to take one of the original maps instead of creating a new map for the game?
Yeah, so we use the same map because we're like most people play on this map, and while we could have designed a new map, it was very important that we use that one because it was familiar enough where people didn't have to like, figure out something new while playing a familiar game. I know even when we played the VR chat version, it was very difficult because even though I knew the map and everyone else knew the map, I got lost and I had to use like the mini map a lot more than I would in the 2D version. Not because the game was like poorly programmed or anything, but it was just like it is so unbelievably different to go into something first person when you're outside. When you're originally in a top-down view, and it's like even though I knew I'm like, okay, this is weapons, and then that one goes there, it just I got so turned around. So I think it was also to avoid some of that since we were able to match the art style better. It was easier to traverse around. One of the difficulties with it was a lot of our artists were like, studying, zooming in on the thing to make sure they get all the details. Some parts of the 2D map don't make sense when you raise them up to 3D. I know there was a point in one of the corner areas where the artists were like, is this a bridge? Are we under something? Just because it in 2D it looks fine, but when you're trying to pull that into 3D, you're like, where does the line go? But they managed to make it work. But I remember a lot of time being like, yeah, I think that goes in front of the thing. And things like that. I think that was one of the bigger challenges. That and making sure like you can traverse easily.
Is there anything that you wish you knew before starting work on the game?
I think I wish I had played the 2D game more because I had played it a bit with friends, but like we weren't super into the social deduction because everyone just gets mad at each other eventually, like So I wish I had played with like random people more because anytime you play with randoms, it's a toss up of whether or not it'd be a good game or not. But it just like introduces you to more about how people play and how people want to play and like what they get out of it. Because I think like they did the like I went into a few random matches where they're like, this is hide and seek. So we tell each other who everyone is and you have to do your tasks before the imposter gets you or whatever. And like, they played on like the speed was like 3 times as fast. So you're zooming around, which is just like not how I had ever played the game. And it was just very interesting to see people make up their own game modes within the base game.
So in the original game, pretty much all the communication is done through text chat during the voting process. But in the VR version, you all decided to make it voice chat and also add a proximity chat during the regular game, which I really liked. Why did you all decide to make this decision when moving it to VR?
I think we still do have text chat. And one of the reasons we decided to not only do that was because I don't know if you've ever typed in VR. It is not fun because you have to do like each letter at a time. So we're like, okay, we'll do voice chat if you opt in. You don't have to. And then we were playing like different versions that had proximity chat, and we're like, wait, this is kind of fun because it didn't feel like proximity chat took away anything from the original game. It was just like you pass someone and you're like, hey, and they like kill you and you're like, oh no. And it was just like a fun thing, especially if you come in on the edge of the proximity chat and you hear someone yell, oh no. So now it's like, well, now I have to go investigate. So it felt like it would have added a bit more rather than taken away. And anytime we played something that had proximity chat, it was like, well, this just kind of adds to the fun, and it is fully opt-in, opt-out. So if you didn't want it, you can just play matches that don't have it.
Are there any fun, small details that you've added into the game but you don't really see most players notice but you really like?
So I was mostly on the pre-production end, so I wasn't on like the full production, which is sad. But I do think that there was a lot of like small decisions that we made, like, choosing to maybe scrap that mini game and put in a new one, or how the map system works and things like that were like very small, that are like, oh yeah, of course we did it that way, but it took like a month to figure out how we were going to do it. I remember talking with our UI designer about how we're like, we need like 8 different versions of this map, because if you're not a town, if you're a crew, then you need this version, but if you're an imposter, you need both the crew and the imposter map. But then if you're a ghost, you need the ghost and it was just a lot where it's like, how do we handle all of these edge cases? And I think it made its way pretty well in the end, but just a small thing you probably wouldn't think about if you're not on that dev end.
What do you feel is the most difficult part about creating games?
The fact that they get done, honestly. Having gone through like from like pre-production to like almost done production, for a few games. It's very hard to get all the devs on the same page, especially in pre-production, because artists are like, well, we have to go, figure out how many polygons we're allowed to use. But like the programmers are like, okay, but I need to figure out all the systems I need to make. And then the designers are like, hey, have y'all ever heard of scope? I haven't. Here's a bunch of game design ideas. And then production is screaming and trying to put everyone in order. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's really hard to compromise on with people, especially when it's like, hey, we kind of need to do this for XYZ, but like we're like, but it's more fun to do it the other way, but you can't afford that or something like that. So once you get into the actual production, I feel like it's a lot smoother, but getting to that point is really hard. And then once production is towards the end, everyone's like, well, the game's done, right? And it's like, well, no, because we have to go spend 5 hours polishing this one little thing that doesn't feel great. So it's like mostly at the beginning and then mostly at the end. That is like really, really hard.
Can fans of the game expect to see more content in the future? If so, what will that new content look like?
Definitely. I know they're cooking up a lot of fun stuff. I don't know if I can explicitly say what it is. There's a roadmap that will be shared, but like I know they have hats. I know when we were still in development, we were talking about different game modes, probably a new map. There's a lot of ideas that people want to do, so it's just a matter of time from when they can get to it.
What was the biggest challenge you faced while working on Among Us VR?
I think when we first started, motion sickness was a huge challenge because I am very susceptible to that. So it was not fun when we're like, hey, tech just figured out how to, get the Among Us actual model into the game. Let's go try that. And then it's like, yeah, we did it. And we're just on the cube trying to walk around. And I'm like, all right, guys, well, I have to go lay down for 3 hours because I just made myself sick. So once we got that figured out, it was fantastic. I think after that, it was just a lot of like, how do we make the very specific decisions about how a specific part of the game will play, where it's like, okay, we have a lot of cool ideas for like how the voting should work, but which one do we choose? Because this one has that problem, that one has this problem, and all those things. And it's also like, oh, but like maybe because we originally had an idea where it's like you physically point at someone to vote for them. And it's like, well, that might be rude in some cultures, and we don't want to, do that. When it came to the movement system, I know I was really sad when we had to get rid of that third person one because I thought it was fun and silly. But then, our project director was like, I also think it's fun and silly, but we can't afford it. So I think it was the hardest part for me was like making a lot of those decisions and then being okay with said decisions when they were determined.
Looking back now, is there anything that you wish you could have done differently with the game?
I feel like there definitely is, but like the end product ended out like fantastic. So it's like hard to really say because I feel like some of the things that's like, oh, we should have changed that was like, maybe we should have, but if we didn't, then XYZ wouldn't have happened or like been fun or whatever. I feel like if anything, it's like a lot of small things. Like I wish we had like started on like accessibility a bit sooner, so that way we knew all the accessibility we wanted, even though we started that really early in development. Or like I wish we had brainstormed different mini games sooner out. But like again, the ones in the game aren't a problem. So a lot of like nitpicky stuff, I guess.
What do you feel is like the biggest lesson that you learned from working on Among Us VR?
I think since this game was always envisioned as like a live service, right? That we knew there are things we wanted to do, but we're like, they can always come later. I feel like that was the hardest thing to like understand because normally just when I make games, it's like, okay, it's out, we're done. Maybe it'll get an update if there's like some game breaking bugs or, just like minor polish things that we didn't get in, but nothing that's like, oh, okay, so we're done with the game, but we've already had 6 people figuring out what they're doing for the next milestone for adding new content. So I feel like that was very hard because I'm like, oh, it'd be so cool to add new game modes. Like we could so easily do this. Wouldn't that be neat? And then our project director's like, yes, but later, and that was very hard to accept, I guess.
What would be your biggest piece of advice to a newer game dev trying to go and create their first game?
YouTube is your best friend. There are so many tutorials. You don't need to spend money to make games. I feel like when I first started, I'm like, oh, I need to make sure that like I could get an artist and I need to buy all these asset packs and I need to do this and that and the other thing. I think I spent like too much money on a course from like Udemy or something. And it's like, well, all those things help. You do not need them to get started. There's plenty of game engines that, don't require art. They're text-based or, have their own built-in art that you can just like use for free. There's a lot of resources out there that don't require money and also don't require like a high-powered laptop and stuff. So like just do it. It's going to be bad. All games are bad until you figure out what you're doing, but just make stuff. It'll be fine.
What's next for you? What are you working on now?
I am currently on the I Expect You to Die 3 team, which was just announced. I'm very excited for that to come out. It's so fun. We're like nearing the end, and I'm just so excited for people to play it and see the puzzles that like I've made, because there's like a handful where I'm like, yes, that was me. And the team plays it, but we all know how to solve everything at this point, so it's no fun. So I want to watch people struggle because it's a hard game. But yeah, very excited for that to come out.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great interviewing you.
Yeah, thank you.
And that was the interview. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, make sure to follow or subscribe. It's different on every platform. Also, if you think a friend might like the show, make sure to share it with them. And consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you want to stay up to date with what's going on with Game Design Hour, make sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok at Game Design Hour. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you next time.